Hi, everybody. I think that we are live. So a warm welcome to all of you. I'm a little wistful looking at the names in the roster of who has signed on, wishing I was seeing you in person. My name is Dorothea von Moltke. I'm one of the owners of Labyrinth Books. And we are back now with our online events after having taken a bit of a break over the summer months. In the meantime, the world has gotten more anxious making rather than less, and we're probably spending more time on Zoom rather than less. So I'm particularly grateful and glad that you are nevertheless here now to spend the next hour tuned into tonight's conversation, a conversation between Daniel Mendelsohn and Michael Wood. I myself feel that we need precisely this kind of a counterpoint of conversations like these to remind us of the world and the values that it turns out we need to be fighting for now, and to preserve. Daniel and Michael are waiting off screen, and I'll soon be bringing them up to talk to us about Daniel's exquisite and also deceptively slim book, Three Rings, A Tale of Exile, Narrative, and Fate. I'm going to show it to you. I don't know how much you can see on screen. You'll have to come into the store and pick it up. It's very beautiful little object too. First, though, a few quick thank yous. We are presenting this event, like so many others, now and also during more normal times in close partnership with our friends at the Princeton Public Library. And shout out in particular to Janie Herman over there, who I think is on the call right now. Princeton University's Humanities Council, similarly, is a co-sponsor for this event and many others. And I am so grateful for that collaboration too. I saw some folks from over there are also here tonight, so hello and thank you. A few practical things. I want to be sure that you know that you can get a copy of Three Rings from Labyrinth Books at 10% off. We can use your support, so if you're planning to buy this book, and you ought to, you can get it from us, and you can order it online, and you should use the promo code Mendelsohn to get your discount, or you can just stop by. You can call us for curbside pickup, or if you'd like to send us an email and get it that way, place your order that way, just send an email to orders.labyrinth@gmail.com. All of that information is also in the chat, and along with our phone number, and our hours are online. So you can also find all of that on labyrinthbooks.com, of course. I'm going to be taking the chat down actually during the conversation, and then I'll bring it back up when we get to the Q&A. Our plan for this next hour is this. I'm going to take maybe 5 minutes to introduce our guests, and then Daniel and Michael will take it from there. But we're going to leave plenty of time for questions after that. And I therefore want to make sure that you know how to ask a question in this particular platform. So please go to, there's an ask a question button at the bottom in the middle of the screen. And if you click on that, you can queue up your question as it occurs to you. Feel free and encouraged to do that. And also, if you see a question already in that queue that interests you as well, there's a little arrow on the side of each question where you can upvote that, and that's an indicator to us that there's a sort of cumulative interest in a particular topic, and we can see that and take it into account. But now on to our guests, who many of you already know. We are lucky to have them back with us. I don't know if with is the right preposition. I don't have a better one. These online events are tiding us over, and I'm extremely glad that they're possible. Daniel Mendelsohn is an internationally acclaimed author. He's a critic, he's an essayist, a translator, and writes prolifically for the New Yorker, also for the New York Review of Books, where he is editor-at-large. He also teaches at Bard College, and I think we have a sense from his books of just how lucky his students must be. Those books include scholarly works on the classics, but Three Rings, which we're talking about tonight, belongs particularly with three previous books that combine memoir and extraordinary erudition, and then I want to say lived questions of literary representation. And those books are An Odyssey, A Father, Son, and an Epic, The Lost, A Search for 6 million, and The Elusive Embrace, The Desire and Riddle of Identity. Now, if I could hand our entire event season over to Michael Wood, I would. He is a critic who makes me want to read or reread everything he talks and thinks about, and an author from whom so many have learned so very much. He's Professor Emeritus of English and Comparative Literature at Princeton University, and also writes regularly for both the New York Review of Books and the London Review of Books. Michael has written influential books on Kafka, Marquez, Buñuel, Yeats. I'm sure there are others I'm forgetting. And is the author also of Literature and the Taste of Knowledge, America and the Movies, and other books. My own favorite is actually his study of oracles, The Road to Delphi, The Life and Afterlife of Oracles. When I said just now that Daniel's Three Rings is deceptively slim, what I meant by that is that it's a book that's just as broad and deep in its preoccupations, and also maybe more obliquely, but I think as personal as his previous memoirs, if that's what we should call them. It's a book about exile and narrative, as the subtitle tells us, with the subtitle's third term, fate, being maybe what's most tested or tried on for fit in the book. And we watch what may or may not be fate, but comes to feel like that, stitched together seemingly disparate and always digressive stories, and stitch Daniel's own story into the larger narrative. So let me turn things over now, though, to Daniel and Michael so they can pull on some of those threads. I'm going to be bringing Daniel up first. His book is not least about the architecture of stories, and it won't surprise you that it both, as he says, of one of the methods of one of his protagonists, it both describes and mirrors. And so, in other words, it is itself also a very complex, has a complex architecture. So we thought it might be helpful and also nice if we started by his reading a brief passage to give you all a sense of this, to orient you a little. So here now is Daniel to read to you and talk to us. If I can bring him up. Give me 1 second. Here we go. Daniel, hi, and welcome. I'm going to take myself down and let you take it from here.
Okay, great. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight. And thank you, Dorothea, for such a generous introduction. And Michael, it's always a pleasure over these many years to see you, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. As Dorothea said, this book is the shortest book that I've written, but I think it's probably the densest. And I thought it would be helpful just to give you a sense of how it proceeds, which is by series of associations that look random at first, but which I hope turn out all to be connected. And so I'm just going to read to you a little bit from the very beginning of the book to give you a sense of how it proceeds, and then I eagerly await the moment when Michael will share the screen with me and we can get to talk about it. So this is just the very beginning. For a period of several years, early in the new century, I was working on a book, the research for which required me to travel extensively through the United States, Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, Israel, and Australia. I went to those places in order to interview a number of survivors of, and witnesses to, certain events that took place during the Second World War in a small Eastern Polish town where some relatives of mine had lived. These relatives were ordinary people of little interest to history, but nonetheless the focus, the center, so to speak, of the story I wanted to tell about who they had been and how they had died, just as the town itself, a place of little historical importance, had yet been the focus of my relatives' lives, the fixed point from which they had never wanted to stray. And so they died there. Some hidden quite close to the house where they had lived, only to be betrayed. Some rounded up and shot in the town square or in the old cemetery nearby. Some transported to remote locales and then gassed. From this small place, the few survivors would later radiate outward, after the war was over, to distant parts of the world, places that, only 15 years earlier, would have struck these townspeople as improbable, absurd even, as destinations, let alone as places to live. Copenhagen, Tashkent, Stockholm, Brooklyn, Minsk, Beersheba, Bondi Beach. Those were the places I had to go 60 years later in order to talk to the survivors and hear the tales they had to tell about my relatives. The only way to get to the center of my story was by means of elaborate detours to distant peripheries. When I was finished writing the story, I found myself unable to move. At the time, I told myself that I was merely tired, but now the distance of a decade and a half permits me to see that I experienced a crisis of some kind, even a kind of breakdown. For some months, I found it hard to leave my apartment, let alone to do any traveling. I had been to Australia and Denmark and Ukraine, Israel and Poland and Sweden, been to the mass graves and to the museums, including one in Tel Aviv where, to my surprise, the thing that moved me most was a room full of meticulous models of synagogues that had, over the millennia, been built through the territory of the Jewish diaspora. In Kaifeng, China, and in Cochin, India, the 6th century Beit Alpha synagogue in Lower Galilee, and the 12th century Santa Maria la Blanca synagogue in Toledo, the 19th century Tempio Israelitico in Florence, and its contemporary, the Oranienburger Straße synagogue in Berlin, all of them now painstakingly recreated in miniature in Israel, a country that did not exist when those buildings were destroyed. The trip to the model room was the only occasion when I cried during my travels. Later, during the period of immobility that followed my return home, I would sometimes find myself in the middle of a room, looking around, unable to remember why I had entered it. Standing perplexed in this way, motionless, I would burst into tears. A psychiatrist friend of mine suggested at the time that I was experiencing a kind of post-traumatic event. Having listened to tales of violence and destruction for 5 years without being able to assimilate them emotionally, because at the time I was listening to them, my only thought was to get the story down, I was now, my friend surmised, having a delayed reaction. It was here, back in the familiar space of my home, that, she said, I was doing my grieving. Whatever the reason, I felt emptied emotionally and creatively. Every time I tried to begin a new project, it was as if I had become one of the elderly witnesses or survivors I had written about, a vacant wanderer, arrived at last at a blank new place, unable to go on.
Fantastic, fantastic, Daniel. I would like to talk in a minute about detours and peripheries that you mentioned there, but could we pause for a second over the gap between the immediate experience and the effect, the belated effect? Because I found that extraordinarily moving, and in a way also very understandable. It seemed intuitively correct in a way, as well as very disturbing.
You mean the gap between the research and the reaction?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting. at the time I was researching this book, you know, I was on the road for 5 years, more or less continuously. And the purpose of these journeys was to track down anyone old enough to have lived in my family's little town in Eastern Poland who might have some, you know, fragment of this tale that I would then try to stitch together. And naturally, whether I was talking to survivors or witnesses, the people I was talking to were very traumatized people. That was clear. And yet, I felt very strongly that I had to just get the story. I was videotaping, I was audio taping. I had to have a sort of emotional zero, because I had to be clear enough in my head to pursue the line of conversation, to probe further, to get behind a story that may or may not seem quite right. And so I was sort of over-exercising my analytical and intellectual muscles, so to speak. And then, and as I wrote, it's true, I mean, of course, I reacted as a human being, sitting across from people telling these terrible stories, but I was sort of storing it all up inside me. And then it was about 6 months after I got home, I made my last research trip in July of 2005 with Froma Zeitlin. And then I started writing the book. And it was after I finished actually writing the manuscript. So I had sort of, you know, I had let flow out everything that I had been accumulating. And then I just had this terrible period. It went on for about 6 months. And I do think my friend's theory was probably on target. You know, I couldn't allow myself to collapse at the moment. And so I saved it up, and it literally paralyzed me. I had a kind of I guess some kind of mild form of agoraphobia. I didn't want to leave my apartment. Now I can also see it as a sort of useful metaphor for a necessary process that has to do with writing and narrative, which is, of course, that one, but not in the story. You know, and I was very interested while I was talking to the people I was interviewing to note a difference. I was always very struck by that people who had been interviewed a lot over the years as survivors, or they had made video testimony, whatever, had a kind of a polished, good story. You know, it had been smoothed out over the years. And I remember being struck by that because of my interest in narrative. When I interviewed a woman who had never been interviewed before, she had never wanted to talk to anybody about her experiences during the war. And it all came out very jaggedly in fragments and bits and pieces. And I thought there's something, at the time I remember noting that there was something there to be explored further about how, as I keep putting it in The Lost, what happened becomes the story of what happened, and they are not, the one is not equal to the other.
What I felt, Daniel, was that this was deeply involved with the actual shape of your book and the book itself, that it was being lived out before it was written. It was being lived out in a way. Because also, there's a question of, it's familiar with narrative, isn't it, general, that there's living and then there's telling the story of having lived. But then there's also this dealing with very fraught, difficult material where the mind needs to create some space, and then the space occupies another space where it's not supposed to be. You know? It's very powerful, I think.
Yeah.
What I would like to ask you about, there's an echo here, which is a little, I can't quite hear whether it's myself talking or you talking, but you talked about detours and peripheries, and within a few pages you take us to a death camp, Belzec, which is all periphery, and so this shape of the book, the ring and everything, has a model there in front of us, this place where it's you say it's no center, all periphery, but it's actually filled with stones, isn't it? So the periphery, you can't walk across it. You have to walk around it. And then I felt the figure of the circle which you have to walk around, can't walk through, arriving by the end with Sebald, a circle's got nothing in it, not even stones.
Right.
So there's this whole movement, quite wonderful.
Yeah, the passage that I read was obviously, I can't read the entire beginning, but growing out of the passage that I just read, there's a point at which I say I visited this model room and I describe some of these models. And as you know, the model becomes a very important sort of leitmotif in my book. But I also describe how Froma and I went to the Belzetz camp, the memorial had just been opened. And I take some time for what looks like a digression into a description of the Belzetz memorial.
It's amazing.
And the camp, I mean, it's interesting in and of itself, but it also, as you rightly say, becomes a sort of symbol for something I'm very interested in. The memorial consists of this vast field, which is the actual extent of the camp itself, which was completely eradicated by the Germans as they withdrew. And the memorial, so this space has now been filled with stones, sort of boulders, little stones, all burnt in some way. It looks like the moon, nothing will grow there. But the act of memorialization consists of a periphery. So there's nothing at the center. And I, as you say, I introduced this whole thing about centers and peripheries very early on. And you have to walk around this field of stones. And as you walk, the name of every town in Europe that sent victims to Belzetz is written out in metal letters that have been affixed to the walkway. So I just thought that was so fascinating because, and I think you're right, I plant that at the very beginning of my book because we're in ring number 1, so to speak, and that does introduce this figure of wandering around rather than going to the center of something. Because the last figure I discuss in the book is Sebald, whose novels I find unbelievably powerful. And I always feel that Sebald is sort of enacting that impossible circumnavigation in his books, which are all haunted by the history of the 20th century and Germany. And yet one feels in the narratives themselves, which sort of perambulate and don't seem to be going anywhere, and the characters who are all frustrated or always engaged in activities that don't pan out, or they're looking for something they can't find. So I just thought that Belzetz, which we just happen, as so often happens, we just happened to be doing the last trip that we went on in the summer of 2005, and we were in Western Ukraine, and Froma heard that the Belzetz Memorial had just opened, and so we went across the border to look at it. One of the many fortuitous strokes that helped us. Yeah.
I just think it's an amazing figure for the notion, which I took from the book, which is some kind of interesting paradox, which is that you can never go back, and nobody ever dies. There's some curious sense that there's nothing there anymore. And I wonder if you talk about your gloss of the word lost. It's in the title of your book, but it appears here with very interesting readings where you more or less suggest that nothing is ever just lost.
Yes, I mean, there are moments when I am describing something, a building, a model, something, and I use the word lost, the original of some ancient building that I'm interested in only now exists in a replica or a statue or something like that. And on the word lost, I always pause because nothing is lost. Things are destroyed usually. And I got very interested in this problem of diction when I was working on The Lost, and I noticed, on my book, The Lost, and I noticed how many of the survivors whom I interviewed, who are none of whom, of course, were native English speakers, when referring even to their own family members who had been murdered, which is the correct verb, always used this word perished, which I always thought was somehow touched by that. It's a kind of an elaborate euphemism, as if they had just vanished. And of course, that got me thinking about the way that we talk about the past. Obviously, I'm interested in this as a classicist, because when one is a classicist, one is studying, 13% of, what remains of an entire culture. And that makes me think all the time I'm lost is a word that makes me think of what is not present, but which exists somehow in a cultural imagination. And so we say, we're always talking as classicists about the lost plays of Euripides. Euripides, there's 19 plays, but he wrote 100. And of course, it's not like Euripides was, getting ready for the cleaning lady and he put them someplace and then he couldn't remember where he put them. These plays were destroyed, they were eaten, they were burned, libraries were attacked and destroyed. And so I think lost is a word that can cover a lot of historical sins, and I'm interested in peeling back what that word means, even when I use it in the title of a book.
Yeah, it's as if the word lost already, as if it's got an evasion built into it, into its uses, as if it's too small, too simple, as if Euripides, exactly as if Euripides just sort of lost the manuscript or the cat ate it or whatever it was, there's something, and there's interesting, but I find it very moving, the idea that such deep sorrows, such grave events, such violences, such horrors are then covered over by this rather mild word, lost, and it's the gap is important.
Yes, I think the gap is important, and because the three main narratives of this new book of mine are about people who were exiled, who had to flee where they live, or were themselves fled because they couldn't bear it. Countries get lost, pasts get lost too. But what are we really talking about when we use that?
Yeah. Do you want to say something about the three figures, Daniel? The central stories.
The main characters, I guess you could say, are three writers who are connected by their interest in either the Odyssey or Odyssean kinds of narratives. Sebald is a creative writer of fiction. Auerbach is a great critic, and sandwiched between them is this wonderful figure whom I love, this 17th and early 18th century French writer, François Fénelon, who wrote in 1699, published a kind of fan fiction based on the Odyssey, The Adventures of Telemachus, in which he takes the character of the son of Odysseus from the Odyssey and he constructs this whole new array of adventures for this character, but designs his narrative so that at the end of his inventive fan fiction, Telemachus is just where he needs to be for the action of the Odyssey to go on. And originally what attracted me to these figures was their interest in the Odyssey. Sebald, in what is my favorite novel of his called The Rings of Saturn, has this wonderful passage set in the present or the post-war years in England of these sisters who take bits of tapestries and weave them together to pass the time, but at night they take them apart, which is a clear reference to Penelope and her weaving. And so I was very interested in following this sort of afterlife of the Odyssey. So there's Sebald with his sort of Odysseus-like meandering narratives. There's Fénelon, who very explicitly sets the Odyssey as both a model and a competitor for his own writing. And there's Auerbach, whose great work about Western literature, Mimesis, begins with a chapter devoted to ring composition, this very special Homeric technique of weaving stories as series of sort of looping narratives that sort of circle through what look like digressions, only to return to the point of origin, which is the style in which this book of mine is written.
Yeah. And there's also yourself, the builder of models, Daniel. You should tell us a bit about that too, because we meet the model in many places. But the story about, I was particularly touched by the moment by you're not finishing the model, when you felt you'd done enough without finishing it.
Yes, so the model is a very important figure in this book of mine because it's the model, making models. I was an obsessive model builder when I was a kid. And because I was already interested in the ancient world, I was always making models of ancient buildings, going to the library and taking out books about Greek architecture, and then, cobbling together these models of the Parthenon in my parents' house. But that impulse to recreate something that has been either destroyed or damaged beyond recognition becomes, for me, a sort of figure of writing also. This, and of course it was important to Auerbach as well, whose book, the subtitle of whose book is The Representation of Reality in Western Literature. And so what does it mean to represent? And can a model ever adequately convey the original? So in my book, one runs into this problem right away in the model room in Tel Aviv, which is certainly a room full of representations of a civilization that has been severely damaged. And then by one of those happy coincidences, a model is a central, is a climactic moment in Sebald's Rings of Saturn, which has to do with the model of the Temple of Jerusalem. And in fact, one of the threads that I weave through my new book is what turns out to be a history of failed attempts to represent the Temple of Jerusalem throughout Europeans. Balls is maybe the most recent, but it goes back at least as far as Racine, who one of whose plays was criticized for its inadequate set decoration in its attempt to represent the temple. And of course, the temple brings us back to the oppression of the Jewish people. So all of these themes, or threads, which seem to be disconnected, unconnected, turn out, at least in my manipulation of them, to be connected. You don't ever get far in Three Rings from religious oppression, political exile, model making, and literature. Those things, as bizarre as it sounds, are all intimately connected. But the model for me is a model of writing. Of the task of writing, a certain kind of writing, certainly not all kinds of writing, but the kind of writing I'm interested in.
Yeah, and there's also a curious sense of success and failure being mingled in a rather complicated way, and that is successfully representing the failure to resurrect these things is actually what writing is often about.
Yes, and in fact, I got so lost in my own digression just now, I failed to answer your question, which was about this description in Three Rings of the final model that I spent years working on. By the time I was in high school, I was a much more sophisticated model builder, and I was going to make this giant model of the Parthenon, a building which itself has been lost many times over the millennia. And I got to a point where I knew so much about the Parthenon. I had studied these very technical, architectural treatises, and I knew the measurements, that making the model no longer seemed necessary. The model
you'd made it. You've made it.
And that I felt to be, all kidding aside, a very Zebaldian moment, where the attempt to represent fails because it's almost beside the point at a certain moment.
I think we will need to we will want to open the discussion to other people in a moment. But one last thing, Daniel, this seems to me to connect to the distinction that Auerbach is making between the Greeks and the Hebrews, and that these two different pictures of narration, of the necessary incompleteness or silence or reticence of one of them, and the fullness and completion amplitude of the other, are very much they turn into the story itself.
Yes. So I've described the three writers I'm interested in. This is sort of a joke in calling this book Three Rings, because there's actually a fourth figure who is not European and who is actually the magician who pulls all of these three rings into what turns out to be one amazing ring. But that is a sort of climax of something that begins, as you say, Michael, with my sort of introductory analysis of Auerbach. So at the beginning of my Mises, he talks about ring composition in Homer. And I should say that the autobiographical part of my book is about my problem writing my last book, An Odyssey, Father, a Son, and Epic, when I had assembled a very big manuscript that I knew, as both the author and as a critic, was not working. And the reason it was not working is because I had three parts of my story, and I had sort of laid them out chronologically, and it just sort of had no steam. And it wasn't until I reconstructed it as an example of, by means of ring composition, that it started to work. And I had gone back to Auerbach because I remember he had this chapter about ring composition, but what I had forgotten was that he's not actually a big fan of ring composition. And he contrasts the Greek mode of narrative with the Hebrew mode, with the manner of narrative that one finds in Genesis. So the Greek mode, by means of these elaborate Chinese boxes or Russian dolls, whose narratives within narratives within narratives, theoretically can tell you everything. If you have enough circles, so to speak, you can say everything about a subject. And he contrasts that negatively, as I had forgotten he did, with the mode of storytelling in the Hebrew Bible, and particularly he uses the example of the sacrifice of Isaac, where it says, they went 3 days to go to the place where he was going to sacrifice Isaac, but he doesn't tell you what happened during those 3 days. And he makes this, whereas a Greek version of Genesis would have told you everything, what happened, who they met, their stories, the stories of their stories. And Auerbach says something which so blew me away, which is that the Hebrew manner, filled with opacities, incompletenesses, gives birth to interpretation. It's precisely the lack of total information about a given scene or a given moment that makes one want to interpret, to supply what is not present. And here we come back to the issue of lostness. And I just thought—
You have a wonderful, You have a wonderful phrase, Daniel. I was very taken with efficient opacity.
Yeah.
Is what the Hebrews provide. Efficient opacity.
Yeah, he thinks opacity is productive of other writing, which I think is so interesting. And of course, there's another kind of hidden— this is very interesting to me because I think in all of my books by now, I have, as a Jewish person who has devoted my intellectual or scholarly life to the Greek and Latin classics, I always myself find that polarization to be fruitful for thinking about my own nature, let's say. This Athens and Jerusalem thing seems not only to have structured a lot of my writing, but a lot of my living as well. And so that's why it was very interesting that when I was having such difficulties with the manuscript of An Odyssey, that I had misremembered what Auerbach, I remembered that he had written about composition. I thought, oh, I'll reread that first chapter of my Mises, and had completely misremembered the fact that he wasn't a great fan of it, and that there was a whole other part of this chapter about the Hebrew Bible. And I thought, my therapist would probably have a lot to say about, I blanked on the Jewish part and only remembered the Greek part. But anyway, all kidding aside, I do think that, and that's why I need to start my book with Auerbach. It's not chronological in its treatment of the authors I'm interested in, because he sort of establishes these poles which have to do with history, but also with the nature of narrative, and necessarily the nature of interpretation, which speaks to me as a critic, as I know it does to you as well.
Yeah, wonderful. Dorothea, should we open up the discussion?
I think, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, of course. We can open it up to questions from people who are tuned in, and Michael, feel free also to just weave more questions of your own in. We still have some time. Maybe I will piggyback on one question that's in the queue, which is just inviting you, Daniel, to talk a little bit more about the two modes of narration in Auerbach. I feel like you then did do that, but I'll piggyback on that because I was curious about the fact that you attach the attribute of optimistic to the Greek mode of narration and pessimistic to the Hebrew mode of narration. And I thought about that a bit and, wondered why for you the mode in which everything is knowable is optimistic, whereas the mode in which not everything is knowable is pessimistic, and whether that in some sense isn't already a measure that's on a scale that is itself a Greek scale.
Yes, I think that's a brilliant point, Dorothea, and it itself bears examining. I think, to some extent, I feel that this, so Auerbach talks about Homer and Genesis, and then I expand to talk about Greeks and Hebrews, and then I add these other labels, as you say, the optimistic, which can tell you everything theoretically, and the pessimistic, which suggests that creation is ultimately not knowable, and even to the extent that it's knowable, it's not describable. So here we are back to the problem of representation. I always feel that this is somehow so fascinating to me, and the answer to your question about why I think the mode that allows us to know everything is optimistic rather than pessimistic has to do with my own split personality as both a critic and a writer. And I always wonder whether that has, I'm not sure how it works, but the critic wants to lay bare, talk about weaving. The job of the critic, or certainly what I like to do as a critic, is to take things apart, to unravel the text and show what the strands are. So that's, as it were, optimistic, the sense that one can do this. One can take a text, and of course, as we know, the word text, which is related to textile, is literally means something woven together. So as a critic, I love to lay bare or to unweave the weaving to show what the threads are. As a writer, my job is to weave things in and let you figure them out. And you may not see all of them, but that's the fun of creating a text. And so that doesn't quite answer your question, which is smarter than what I'm able to come up with now, but it did make me think about whether I'm personally interested in this question, because I do two very different kinds of writing myself. But I do think there's probably a slight Greek bias there.
Yeah, unless pessimism is not such a bad thing, which, we don't have to assume that it is. It's not the same as despair or something. But let me go back to the queue, where there's also a question about Fenelon, and in particular the character of Mentor. The question is whether we would have mentor as a verb, whether that figure of mentor was a well-known figure among educated people even before his book.
No, in fact, it's a very interesting story. The reason we have this term mentor as a character in the Odyssey, there at the beginning of the Odyssey, Athena, who's protecting Odysseus and his family, takes on the appearance of this old family friend called Mentor, but it's a quite minor thing to the Odyssey. It's because of Fénelon and Les Aventures de Télémaque that Mentor entered so many languages in the sense that we know it. One has to remember, and I was, I'm hardly a great authority on Fénelon, but immersing myself for many months in this material, the book that he wrote, which was intended for the grandson of Louis XIV, whose tutor he was, and was really meant as an edifying text about what the right, how to be a good prince. And so he uses these tales that he talks about Telemachus meeting, good kings, bad kings, as a sort of ethical instruction manual. This was the best-selling book in Europe for 100 years. Anyone who goes to secondhand bookshops or antiquarian bookshops, it's very easy to find a copy because it's so hugely popular. And that's how Mentor entered the language. It was not primarily because of Homer, it was because of Fénelon's adaptation of Homer, because in his text, young Prince Telemaque, who's obviously supposed to be a mirror for this actual young prince he wrote the book for, is given a guide in the form of Minerva in this version, who is disguised as Mentor throughout the text. So Mentor is the great sage, the guide, the wise, scolding, loving adult. And that's how Mentor got to be Mentor.
Yeah, nice. I want to encourage everyone, if you have a question, you can just queue those up. We'll have time for a couple more if there are some. There's a question here, though, Daniel, also, this one goes back to your Odyssey book. Judith wants to know whether in writing about the Mediterranean cruise with your father, you took any poetic license about the ship not reaching Ithaca, and whether you did that in order to introduce Cavafy's poem. So was that a kind of ruse to get Cavafy in there?
No, I always say the hard part about writing nonfiction is all you have to work with is what happened, and then you have to turn it into a story. Novelists have it easy. They can do anything they want. But all kidding aside, that really happened. We were on this Odyssey cruise, and on the last day of the cruise, we were supposed to go to Ithaca. Hello, that's the great destination. And there was a strike. It was summer of 2011, terrible strikes all over Greece, and they shut down the Corinth Canal. So there's no way to get from the western part of Greece back to Athens in time to get everybody's planes home without going through the Isthmus of Corinth. And so we had to skip Ithaca so that we could get back to Athens. And I thought that was so great.
That's great.
Everybody else said, oh, poor you, your father, who's never going to see Ithaca. And I thought, this is, if I were writing a novel,
yeah.
I'd write it better. And what happened was, and this is true, the captain called, so I got a note at lunch once and said, the captain wants to see you on the bridge. So I went up to the bridge and he said, I know that you did a translation of Cavafy. And because we cannot go to the real Ithaca, would you mind, because we now have a whole day at sea, we're going to be sailing around the entire Peloponnese, would you mind filling in the day at sea by giving a lecture about Cavafy's poem, Ithaca? So no, I did not take any poetic license. It really happened. But I think, part of it's an interesting question because, Michael and you, Dorothea, in your introductions called attention to this last word of my subtitle, faith. And I'm very interested in all kidding aside, as a nonfiction person, I only deal with what happened. But what happens is so often so extraordinary. And as anybody knows, and I know Froma is here and she was with me on this remarkable research trips for The Lost, the most amazing coincidences kept happening during the research and writing of that book. And it got me thinking why things happen. And I don't have the answer, by the way. But one of the things that's true is it has to do with the way you notice things. Every writer knows this. When you're suddenly working on a subject, suddenly everything that happens seems to be about what you're writing about, And so it's a matter of perspective. And I got very interested in it as someone, as both a writer and a critic, who's interested in how stories are constructed, what you choose to notice, what you don't notice, what you leave out, what you keep in, all of that is part of why things happen. And in Three Rings, I keep drawing the reader's attention to the way that I am narrating these true life stories in a way that highlights these amazing parallels, coincidences, connections that some other biographer might not draw attention to because she's not interested in this question. So what happens in its relation to the story of what happens is part of this problem that I find so interesting. And so I've mentioned this in the context of this particular question because those things really happen. But some other person writing about the cruise might not even have thought it was so interesting that I gave a lecture on Cavafy at the end of an Odyssey cruise.
Another thought, Daniel, would be that on other cruises, when you're not there, they presumably make it to Ithaca.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. I'd like to get to one question still that's in the queue because I think it opens up another dimension of the book that we haven't talked maybe as much about as we might have, which is the question of exile. So this question asks how the writing in particular of Sebald and Fenelon is related to their exile. And now, for some reason, I think we have lost Daniel for a second here, who's trying to reconnect. Let me just see how that happened and whether I need to do anything to let him. Yeah, he's coming back in. I think, if I see that right. Yes, he should be right back on our screen. He has accepted.
Hi.
Wait, were you trying to duck that question, Daniel?
No. I went into exile. I was so terrified.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, in the case of Fenelon, so there's two issues here. One is biographical. So Fenelon was already involved in this, at the time, very famous theological dispute, and Louis the King was very unhappy with him. And so he sent him away from Versailles to his actual diocese, which was in this place called Cambrai. Proustians take note. And there was, but when this book, The Adventures of Telemachus, was published, that sealed his fate. He was never going to come back after that. And so he was never returned to court because of this book that he wrote based on the Odyssey. Auerbach, of course, we know he had to run away from Germany because of Hitler. And Sebald was, as I see it, self-exiled from Germany because he just couldn't deal with, as someone born in 1944 and growing up in post-war Germany, one senses that he just couldn't deal with the burden of German guilt. So that's a biographical explanation of the connection. But I think, to me, what's interesting is that these three men who were forced from their homes and themselves took very circuitous routes to where they ended up are all interested in kinds of narratives that do that. You know, they either analyzed or created narratives that play with wandering, digression, peripheries, the relationship of the periphery to the center. So that's why they were particularly satisfying to me to think about in this book, which combines both biography and literary analysis.
Yeah, that's really nice. So, and I think this brings us pretty much to the top of the hour. I always am a bit at a loss as to how to wrap these events up, because we sort of fall into a void when we just log off. But I want to thank most of all Daniel and Michael for your time here with us. I want to encourage you all to go and take a look at this book, to find the book. If you are logged in from elsewhere, one of the lovely things about these online events is that you can be far-flung and join. And you want to buy the book, buy it from an independent local bookstore, wherever you are.
Yes.
And if you are in Princeton, we'd love to see you in the store. Put this book in your hands. It really is very gorgeous and rich. It has both the sort of gift and the curse of making, I mentioned this to you, Daniel, of making one then see ring narratives wherever one looks, and so it actually opens up into you take it into your reading of so much else once you've finished this the pages of this book. It's marvelous. So another thank you to the two of you. Warm thanks to all of you, and I wish you a lovely evening and hope to see you all in person soon. Wishing you good health and goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye, and thank you.
Bye. Yeah, take care.
Bye. Thank you.